All right, let's begin. Thank you all for coming out in such beautiful weather for the technology panel. I'll start off just by introducing the moderator and letting him take over the show. That's Claude Grunitsky. He's the founder of Trace and True Africa, a new media tech platform championing the young African voices all over the world. Trace, which now reaches an audience of more than 100 million people across 150 countries, was successfully sold to a French investor group in July 2010. Claude was raised between Lomé, Togo, Washington, D.C., Paris, London. There's not a place he's not been. He speaks 6 languages, carries 3 passports, and was exposed to many different cultures. These foreign interactions have shaped his transcultural and philosophy and informed the creative energy of his media ventures. An MIT Sloan Fellow, Claude is a founder of the Young Entrepreneurs Forum in Togo. Claude is also the board member at Humanity in Action, a foundation that works internationally to build global leadership, defend democracy, and protect minorities and improve human rights. Claude.
Thank you all. Thank you, first off, for this wonderful introduction. This discussion is going to be about an hour. It's going to be an hour, and then we're going to leave 15 minutes for Q&A. And I'm so happy that we have an almost full room on a miserable, snowy, rainy day like this. So I'm really glad you were able to come through, because this is going to be more of a conversation than a panel discussion. I'm very, very fortunate to introduce a form of diversity that we have here. We don't have any women on the panel, but we have New York, we have another New York, we have Nigeria, we have Togo. But what's interesting is we all have different ways in which we overlap with Africa. And I actually overlap with all 3 of these organizations in different ways, and it's good that Harvard African Development Conference is actually bringing us together. So I'm gonna start with Dan Heimovitz, who I actually met for coffee in London 2 years ago. And it just randomly we're on the same panel. I met him for coffee when he was living in London working for Tony Blair. Now, a lot of people don't know that Tony Blair is very, very involved in Africa. I actually was speaking at a conference with him in Abu Dhabi about 2 years ago, and he literally was speaking about Guinea and the investment opportunities in Guinea, switching from French to English. At that time, he was running the African Governance Institute as well, and it's now called the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. So Dan is a representative of that, and so he's worked across many countries. He spent time in Liberia, he spent time in other African countries, and he's a true transcultural. So he's going to talk about how technology is affecting the work that he does with respect to governance. Then yesterday, I got to finally meet the lead product evangelist of DreamAfrica, and he's going to have to explain what a lead project evangelist actually is. Torin Perez is very well known for being a Brooklynite, a New Yorker who moved to Cape Town and discovered a new passion for Africa, and he's now dedicating his life, his work, to finding a way to do what we do, which is actually championing young African voices and creating content from an African perspective that resonates not just in Africa and the African diaspora, but also globally. So we're going to talk about that and the role of technology in kind of inspiring change through new narratives. And then finally, we have Chike Okwegba, right? And he is from Nigeria, but he also lived in London. He is a New Yorker, and he's one of those people you see in TED Talks. He really likes to evangelize African technology, but he's also doing it from a transcultural perspective because he's active all over the world. And his company, the startup, which is called Startup 52, is making a bit of noise right now, so he's going to start doing that. So before we jump into the actual, programmatic side of things, I'm going to get each of the panelists to expand a little bit on the work they actually do, starting with the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change.
Thanks. Thanks, Claude. So, I'll just talk a little bit about what my organization does. So we as of a month ago, we're the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. I'll just talk about the sort of Africa governance part of the work we do. So there are other parts of the organization that aren't really relevant to sort of Africa or what we're discussing here, but also I'll focus on that. This is a continuation of, as Claude said, the previous organization called the Africa Governance Initiative. And what we do is we work with African leaders to support them. This is at the presidential and prime ministerial level to deliver on their policy priorities. So we are, some have described us as sort of non-profit management consultants to government. So we're not sort of going to tell the government of Rwanda what the right policy is. We're going to work with them on whatever issue areas they focus on. So that kind of varies across country. It might be energy in one country, agriculture in another country. It really depends. So that's where that's what we work on. And we have basically embedded advisors who work inside government offices, side by side with government leaders to help get things done. Why am I on this panel? I am not a technology expert, full disclosure. I think I'll try to speak to at least, is the intersection of technology and governance. And what are some of the opportunities and challenges that come with that. So that's what I think I can talk to a bit. And just to say, my organization, I think, takes a sort of, and we've heard some mixed views today, we take a more optimistic view of governments and what they're doing. So just 10 days ago, I was in Nairobi for a conference with top advisors to presidents from a number of African countries. And I certainly came away feeling very inspired about these leaders. Sure, there are some less positive stories on the continent in terms of governance, but there's some really great, inspiring, talented leaders in government today who are trying to reform their systems, trying to get things done for citizens. And so that is sort of how my organization tends to start, to try to work with leaders who are serious about results for citizens in their country.
Great. I'm glad you mentioned the fact that you're not like the tech experts, because this is not going to be extremely technical. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of blockchain or anything like that. I really want to talk about how technology can lead to change if it's implemented and disseminated in the right way. And so, Torin, in the work that you do and your team does with DreamAfrica, it's just a great name already. DreamAfrica is a wonderful name for a company. And so can you tell us a little bit about what the mission and vision might be behind DreamAfrica?
So real quick, everybody just say, "We Dream Africa." On the count of three. 1, 2, 3.
We Dream Africa.
It has a good ring to it, don't it?
Yes.
So I'm an inner city kid from Brooklyn. I had a chance to win a leadership scholarship from the Posse Foundation to go to one of the best colleges in the nation. So I go from the inner city to a college that has primarily upper middle class and upper class whites. I'm struggling to figure out what my identity is. After my freshman year, I had a chance to go and live in South Africa with the World Teach program, which was actually founded by the Harvard Kennedy School. And I lived there with a German host family. I worked with teenage entrepreneurs in a black township, and I was teaching English in a colored community. And in that experience, I was totally blown away with the perspective of how big the world is that's out there. For the most part, I just imagined that one day I might go to Africa, kiss the ground, and go on a safari. Those were the images that I had in my mind. But going there, I've kind of found myself amongst each of these populations. You know, the German family who I love dearly to this day, all the kids are about to go to college now. The black community where, you know, I'm from Brooklyn, so I get it. I get the challenge that we face in our own skin sometimes in our communities when we're trying to find opportunities and create opportunities. And then in the colored community, it was almost like I was welcomed like family just because of the color of my skin. So it was very interesting to kind of have that experience, but what it did was it broadened the horizons for what I could see for myself as a change agent, as a person who cares deeply about making people's lives better. And when I came back, I found myself deeply immersed with the International Students Association at Lafayette College. There's a couple of alums in the room, actually. And some of my best friends, actually, before we even knew DreamAfrica would exist, we used to perform Kwaito dance and stuff in front of hundreds of people at Lafayette. When I met the founder of DreamAfrica, he was walking across campus his first day in America with his mom, and a total stranger, who was me, rolled up to him and said, "Vipi bana," which I don't know if any of y'all from Kenya, you speak Swahili, but that's basically like, "What's up?" And he looked at me like, "What the hell?" And so in that moment, he immediately realized that I had respect and curiosity about his culture. And we've been best friends ever since that day. And so Dream Africa has a couple of foundational principles that is behind our mission. One is I want the vast majority of us in this room to be positively and well represented in the digital media images that we see. That's one. Number two is Africans have been and are good enough to tell our own stories. So if you all are familiar with Chimamanda Adichie, she had the obviously famous Danger of a Single Story TED Talk. What we now realize is each of us in this room have tremendous stories. The communities that we're from, Africa has 2,000 different languages, 2,000 different ethnic groupings. The diversity and the creativity on the continent is incredible. But if the only thing that we have to look to is Lion King or Madagascar, those stories will never have a place to be showcased and celebrated. So Dream Africa is a mobile application that distributes everything from multimedia content like audio stories that might be folktales to films and animations. And so what we really want to do is we want the new repetition to be, if you want to come out and find out about Nigeria before you go there, come to Dream Africa and see some real stories. So that's what we're doing.
I like that. Wonderful. We need to. Now, Chike, you are an evangelist for entrepreneurship, for African entrepreneurship, for entrepreneurship in general. You speak about this all the time because you're living the dream and you're also living the struggle, right? The life of an entrepreneur is risk-taking, is a struggle. And so one of the main things I want to deconstruct during this talk is like this whole myth around, entrepreneurship and then the technology as a result of technological entrepreneurship is going to solve all of Africa's problems. There's this thing like to become really super cool to talk about Africa just needs better technology and maybe better governance, and then everything will go away. So in the work that you do with Startup 52, can you tell us the kind of impact that you want to have?
I mean, I don't know how I'm supposed to, follow that act. So it's
Before
funny.
we start, why don't I tell them? So Chike has this startup accelerator called Startup 52. Dream Africa is a product of Startup 52.
Actually, yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I meant. Yes. So at this point,
Full circle.
so it's funny because I had told Claude, I'm like, I usually like to go last when I introduce myself because then it gives me a clue of what to say, after listening to people. So when Torin started talking, I said, maybe I should have gone second so I don't have to follow that act. But my name is Chike. I'm Nigerian. Very, very, very Nigerian. I like to say that. Live in New York. I've been in New York for 15 years now. So I studied engineering, biomedical engineering. But then somehow found my way into entrepreneurship. And actually, that came about from working in public policy. So I was a Colin Powell Fellow for a number of years, focused on public policy, and decided to focus my research on youth disconnection. So why were kids out of school and out of work? Because when I moved from Nigeria to New York, if you know anything about Nigerians or Africans, period, you know that our parents don't play with education, right? So you're either a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're a doctor, you're an engineer, or a lawyer, right? And if you're not good enough for engineering or medicine, better be a lawyer. And then if you're not good enough for law, then go to study accountancy or something. I don't know. Every other thing doesn't make sense. You're just wasting their money. So the only reason why I was allowed to come to the US actually was you're going to go study biomedical engineering and then go on to medical school. That was the path set out by my parents for me. Except that, after 5 years of biomedical engineering, I said, well, I'm losing hair and I'm not even 30 yet, so medical school is not going to happen. But anyway, so I focused on youth disconnection and realized that for many of these young people who were extremely talented, they just needed opportunities, right? There were brilliant ideas. They knew what their problems were. They had solutions to the problems. Nobody just believed in them, period. So we went from teaching them about entrepreneurship to launching these small businesses and all that brilliant stuff, to teaching them about tech entrepreneurship. And some of the startup ideas that came from them were mind-blowing. Like, all right, so fine. How do we create better resources, better access to resources and capital for this invisible communities? And that was actually how Star 52 was launched. Except that when we started doing the research on, what was out there focused on this community, we realized that there was actually a bigger need. There were people like me and like Torin, not necessarily like you, who were highly educated, working on brilliant stuff, but lacked the access to resources and capital to launch their ventures. So the question was, how do we create that access? So we upgraded from invisible communities to what we now call untapped communities. So women, people of color, immigrants, seniors, veterans, LGBTQ communities, and all that. So we usually say, if you feel like you don't belong, you actually belong with us. So Star 52 was launched in 2015 to do that. And being passionate about Africa, I had initially thought, well, maybe if we start in Africa, it'll be a lot easier. You galvanize people and we can make this happen. Except that I went to Nigeria for 3 months, networked with as many people as you can, talked to everyone you could talk to, and it was the most frustrating experience ever, period. The first question you get is, what's in it for me? Like, we haven't even talked about anything yet, So anyway, we launched 2 years ago, and DreamAfrica was actually part of the pilot class. Ever since, we currently have a portfolio of 22 companies. And for this year, the goal is actually to scale this out. So we're launching a class in Nigeria with partner organizations as well as New York. And the goal, of course, is, open up more doors for people like us who are brilliant, who have excellent ideas, who have the next unicorn ideas to solve global problems, right? And like you said, I know technology may not solve all our problems, but it will go a long way to helping us create opportunities for ourselves that governance may not necessarily do for us. So my passion for Africa, one, is being Africa, being African, being Nigerian, and understanding that the next wave of unicorns and success and the billion-dollar companies, I believe, will come from Africa.
Well, I thank you so much for kind of clarifying it for us. We're going to jump straight into it because I have to admit that I'm one of those people who have been cheerleaders for African tech, for the past pretty much my entire career. And as a media entrepreneur and who's becoming more and more of a tech entrepreneur, I get to meet a lot of people who are trying to create real change on the continent. And most people end up failing. The very large majority of ventures that I've seen have not done well. And there's many reasons for that, right? It could be leadership, it could be skills, and so on. But one thing that we need more of in Africa is better leadership. A lot of our countries have either terrible or very bad, very, very, very bad leadership. Now, when you're coming in with the Tony Blair badge, Tony Blair, for better or for worse, he's very controversial. People like him, people don't like him. When you're coming in, Tony Blair was a very important leader for the UK, and he's inspired many, many social democrats across Europe. And the fact that he's now very much kind of vocal about focusing on Africa, it means that there's a lot of pressure for someone like you, Dan, coming in as an outsider at the presidential and prime minister level. So I really want you to tell us about the experience that we discussed yesterday with respect to the Ebola crisis, and when you're facing such a huge kind of public health issue that the governments are overwhelmed. I actually worked on this as well from the Guinea perspective. The governments are overwhelmed. Everybody's talking about it. No one knows what to do. The big organizations and NGOs and the World Health Organization, everybody's fighting. Everybody's trying to take credit for the few advances that are being measured. So when you're coming in from Tony Blair's organization, and you're working with the head of state, and you're in Liberia, tell us how that operates and how data and data science and technology may or may not have helped to solve the main issue.
Sure. So I'm going to talk about that second, if that's okay. But I am going to follow your advice. You said, when I told you what I was going to talk about, you said, Dan, that's too much. Just pick two things.
Right.
So I'm going to do just two things.
Okay.
So that's going to be the second thing. So if that's okay. So I'm going to do, I just want to make 2 points about the intersection of technology and governance. And the real thing is, how can technology make governance better and work better for citizens in Africa? That's, I think, the question. And I'll do one, I think, positive thing, and then on this Ebola example, I think the less positive example of that. So I think the positive thing is there's a really interesting, exciting opportunity that's starting to happen in Africa, which is strengthening the link between government and citizens and how technology can do that. So I mentioned how 10 days ago I was at this event in Nairobi. I had the chance to talk with the Deputy Chief of Staff to the President of Kenya, Nzioka Waita, who's a really inspiring guy, formerly had worked with Safaricom, so actually in the tech sector. And one thing he said is, it's really interesting. We know how young a continent Africa is demographically. And he said, one of the things that's really hard is millennials are incredibly impatient. And when we in government aren't getting things done quickly, what the first thing you see is a hashtag on Twitter, ripping you for not getting things done.
Right.
And it was really striking at this event how much these are senior leaders in government, and frankly, it was really interesting hearing how much pressure they feel to get things done, and how much to deliver for citizens in a way that I think is a little surprising. And I don't want to say it's completely a result of technology, but I do think is a little bit a result of the fact that things are a bit more transparent. There's a way for citizens to speak back to government in a way that there wasn't, many years ago. So I think that's a really exciting trend. There's so much to talk about on this. I'll just use one example from Kenya that I think is interesting. A tangible way that technology allows government or holds pressure on government to deliver better for citizens. So basically the Nairobi Water and Sewerage Corporation that's responsible for water and sanitation services in the city of Nairobi, they've rolled out basically an app. It's called Maji Voice. And what it does is it just allows citizens to complain much more quickly to this corporation. And when they rolled it out, the Nairobi Water and Sewerage Corporation, within months, they had received a 10-fold increase in complaints. Right? Now that sounds like a bad story, but because of that, they were resolving issues twice as frequently and twice as fast over time as a result of the fact there was an easy way for people to basically complain when things weren't working well. That's just a sort of a small example in a way, but I think there's so many examples like that where there's just an easier way for citizens to speak back to government, and when governments are embrace that, there's a real power here to start to see government to work better in the way that we all want it to. So that's
I have to push back just a little bit because Nairobi is, in some ways, the most advanced city in Africa with respect to communications and connectivity. And if you go back to Ushahidi and the role that they had in kind of contesting some of the presidential results, and maybe like 8 years ago, then of course not every African city has that kind of infrastructure for kind of public discourse in that way. Fees was small, maybe in Johannesburg, but I don't think we can generalize across the continent.
This is it's a fair point. I mean, but this is it's an SMS-based app, so you don't even need a smartphone to use it. Right. Point taken. And look, you need a government that basically said, we are using this, we want to hear back from you. Right. So to me, it's more of an issue of like government embracing this role of seeing that sort of pressure and direct communication with citizens is going to help them be a better service provider. I think that, to me, that's this bigger sort of barrier almost more than like technology.
But let's stay there for a second. This is a really important point. It's been now, I think, for 65 days since the English-speaking part of Cameroon has not had access to the internet because the government just decided to shut it down. So what do you do when you cannot even access, same thing happened in Morocco during the COP22 UN Climate Change Conference. What do you do when you cannot even access your internet because the government decided that, you don't deserve it at the moment?
Yeah, no, I agree.
Maybe we should talk about that afterwards in the Q&A session, but, keep going, sorry, I had to make that point.
Yeah, no, that's a good example. So just the Ebola example. So like my one, so that's, I think, a sort of positive story about how tech can make governance work better in Africa and elsewhere. A less positive story is, I think a few examples I've seen, and my organization has seen, when what I describe as tech overexuberance comes into play, and you're sort of using tech because it feels like the exciting solution to a problem, and maybe it's not necessarily the best solution for what you're trying to do. So as you said, Claude, I worked on the Ebola response in Liberia in 2014. I was sort of a de facto chief of staff to the Liberian crisis manager in Monrovia. And one of the big challenges of managing the response to Ebola is is a story of data. You need to know where, first of all, where all the current cases of the disease are, and you also need to be able to track really closely who has been in contact with those cases, right? Because that's where the next cases of the disease are. So you need to be able to track it and map it really well. And when you're on top of that, that's when you start to get on top of management of the disease. That's when you're able to sort of quickly identify the next set of cases, and that's when eventually Liberia was able to successfully manage the response. So it is a real data story. A really interesting thing that I saw was you had at the apex of the crisis, you had, for example, the U.S. Center for Disease Control offering the Liberian government, the Ministry of Health in Liberia, a software package to manage this data, right? To sort of track all this data. That seemed like a really nice offer, except this solution you couldn't log in from multiple computers, and so it basically wasn't working. And there were other examples of international organizations coming in with supposedly fancy software that didn't really work. It became extremely frustrating, and eventually what the government did was use Excel. They used Excel, which is a program invented over 30 years ago, to track data, and guess what? That eventually was sufficient to manage, again, the sort of tracking of current and future cases in a way that got it done for Liberia. So there's an example that I, very, very closely worked on that was striking, where technology that looked like it was going to be a better solution actually maybe wasn't the better solution. I'll use this another example from Rwanda, where my organization works with the government. One of the things we work with the government on is energy. We heard President Mahama earlier talk about the importance of energy generation in Africa, and it's definitely a priority for many of the governments that we work closely with. So there is a lot of exciting technological advancement related to energy, right? There's all kinds of renewable energy sources that are now opportunities for development in a way that previously you didn't have, whether it's hydro, wind, or solar. That's really great. One example, though, again, just a little bit of something we've seen that's a little tricky, is sometimes people push this solution when it's not always the right solution. So there's been a lot of pressure, frankly, from international organizations for the Rwandans to develop mini hydro plants, which is great, except...
Can you explain what it is? Because I guess not everyone in our audience would know what a mini hydro plant is.
Yeah, so these are just very, very small scale hydroelectric power plants, basically, right? So they typically use rivers, right? And again, you're just talking about much smaller scale than larger scale developments you've used in the past.
Yes.
So the problem is if the rivers aren't running at the flow, with the power that you need it to, you can't actually use it. So what's starting to happen is you're actually needing to develop other sources of energy to duplicate what these mini hydros are doing, which is a huge extra burden financially on the government and eventually citizens in an unnecessary way. So just, again, another example of where, frankly, in this case, internationals are coming in, pushing the government to sort of use these fancy new technologies when maybe it's not always the right call, even if, again, there may be certain times when it is. So again, technology, has been some really exciting opportunities for improving governance in the first case, but I think also just a sort of cautionary note about when tech becomes the overexcited solution that maybe isn't the right call always.
Exactly. So it's ultimately really about the right calibration for the population, and that's one of the things that I found really exciting in our discussion yesterday, Torin, with the way that you're approaching DreamAfrica and making it available to people who just cannot afford these very, very high costs of data. I mean, these data plans in Africa are so expensive. I mean, this is something that I face every day trying to publish DreamAfrica because it's too expensive for them to access our videos. So once they've downloaded 2 videos, they're done. They can't, So I want to talk a little bit about how you've identified free basics as an opportunity to help to spread that message, and how you're approaching affordability, accessibility for quote unquote underserved populations.
So Facebook and Google and the Microsofts of the world, they all have these kind of free resources that are available to entrepreneurs and startups. So what we do is, I always say that an entrepreneur's greatest resource is not his resources or her resources, it's his or her resourcefulness. And so how do you find access? How do you find different tools or partnerships where there's a mutual exchange of services or agreement that brings value to you and to them? Facebook wants to support entrepreneurs because they know if you're using Facebook, that means that you're probably going to tell other people about Facebook, and that's good for Facebook. And so we actually just started off in one of their basic kind of free accelerator programs. They give you different credits for like Facebook advertising, things of that sort. But they also create an opportunity for you to apply to be part of their Free Basics program. What Free Basics is essentially is if you have a feature phone in a developing world, I think they're in somewhat upwards of 30 different countries now, you can actually access the internet and get access to like mostly basic information, like most frequently health-related information. So it was actually a pretty big deal that we had some sort of educational, entertaining content that was able to make it to the platform. And we're still figuring out what that's going to look like in long term, but there is a basic experience where people can go and check out some stories on their feature phones, which is amazing. I think, however, though, I would be remiss if I didn't share that, there's a massive middle-class consumer on the continent. I think it's somewhere upwards of 250 million. Obviously, that distribution is going to be different across the different nations. You've got the kings now, Kenya, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Ghana, and South Africa, which are really leading in terms of internet penetration and income levels and that sort, the more developed economies and cities. But I was in Nairobi last year, launching our operations in Kenya with our team, and you go to KFC, which is right next to the Ministry of Education, all that, and the government, Nairobi City County government, and people are spending 600 Kenyan shillings for a crunch burger and some fries, and we're offering DreamAfrica at premium access to our library at 600 Kenyan shillings per month. So you have a massive middle class that's there that can afford a lot of things. And that price point has seemed to be accessible to many of the consumers that we've spoken with. So I think as our value goes up, we may consider pricing changes and stuff, but we're always kind of thinking about what does it mean to give access, because ultimately this idea of storytelling and having our stories shared and showcased, it's something that I want everybody to have that access to. I remember being in Nairobi and speaking with one of the staff members in the ministry, and the really cool thing is you get to build relationships with people. It's not a transactional thing. You have to go back and they have to get to know your face before you do any business out there. And so we were just kind of exchanging some personal stories, and when she found out exactly why we were there every day, because the hustle is real, and you're trying to launch something, we told her, we said, we'd love to have your stories from your village on our platform. And her eyes started to well up, because she said, I can't believe that, one, there's a way for me to preserve my heritage and for our traditions to pass along to my grandkids, but you're also saying that we're worthy of that as well. And so the young women, the women who are in the families that are in the villages that are disconnected, when a lot of the folks who work in the cities, they go back sometimes, maybe once a month or on the weekends, to see their families. And some of those stories can actually be recorded and shared on our platform. So I think for us, as we think about access, we want as many ways as possible for people to be able to access and have a chance to experience and share on DreamAfrica.
So I want to stay there for a minute. On the whole issue of access, the overarching theme of this discussion is collaboration, right? It's how do we get people to work together to provide services, in this case, technology. Now, when I'm hearing that, I'm seeing, okay, once again, we're in Africa, we're in Kibera, in a suburb of Nairobi, and we're waiting for Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg and white people to come save us. And so my question is, how do you get to kind of foster these collaborations, perhaps with local authorities or governments, in order to make it a win-win for everyone? Yes. So again, Africa is not in the receiving end, hat in hand. Oh, thank you for giving us this access to the internet.
Yes. So if y'all noticed the question that I asked in the keynote just now, I'm all about the positive movement. If y'all are working on positive stuff, I want to see you win and progress. If I'm working on positive stuff, I would like for y'all to see me win and progress. And Martin Luther King Jr. has a wonderful quote. He said, "Those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war." And so I'm big on collaboration, big on how do we move things and change things. Now, I was reading an article recently by the author of The Next Africa. It's a really interesting book, not just because we're featured in it, but he does really wonderful stories on tech and business and investment in Africa. His name is Jake Bright. And he showed in 2004, there was practically no Google search results for African tech, African investment, African business. And now there are, in 2014, the statistic was like 25 million, right? Which is not a gigantic number when you think about the internet, but it shows that the global interest is growing. Now, when I say that, we need to do a great job, and you're doing a great job of this with your media platform now in terms of journalism, showcasing the stories of people who are getting it right and doing it. So when Mark Zuckerberg made his first trip to the continent a few months ago, one of the places that he went was our co-working space in Nairobi, which is iHub. And one of the organizations that's based there is called BRIC. I'm a TED resident. BRIC was actually founded by TED Fellows a couple years back. And what they did was they created something called a BRIC, which is a solar-powered kind of box that would host like 20 different devices that could get their power, and it would source the power to 20 different devices, right? They would then send to like rural communities so they would have access to different pieces of content and different things like that. Now, what they've recently done and launched just a few weeks ago is something called the Super Brick, which is a 5 terabyte Wi-Fi box that can now support up to 100 people connecting to it, and up to 50 people on that one box streaming video. And so what that means is that the technological innovation that's happening will over time reduce some of these cost challenges that the media providers like ourselves are dealing with. You also think about the Facebooks and the Googles and any of those, the Safari companies, all those companies what they're trying to do is they're trying to increase the availability of internet. So you've got the drones, you've got a bunch of different technologies, the balloon technologies from Google that are creating enough satellite experience. But then now, hardware producers like BRIC, making super bricks, are making sure that there are distribution channels for that internet to make sure that it's more effective. Because we're not gonna have much technological innovation if we have one Wi-Fi box here, and when Dan, me, and Chike get on it, I gotta tell him, nah, man, it's my turn to watch videos.
So you really provided me with the perfect segue into the question that I was gonna ask Chike, which is, when you talk about these unicorns and these big companies, I said a lot of the companies that I've been following ended up failing, but many of them have this huge buzz around them that is sometimes deafening. And one of those companies is Grow Intelligence. I don't know if anybody has heard of the agricultural data company Grow Intelligence, Sarah Menker. So they're making a lot of noise. Fantastic company. Once again, they started gaining traction in where else? Nairobi. So every time I talk about it, it's always Nairobi this, Nairobi that, Nairobi this. So Chike, in terms of us kind of being the stepchildren from West Africa, what are you seeing, apart from Mandela, which everybody talked about last year because they received the $24 million in funding in a round that was led by Mark and Priscilla Zuckerberg. We know about that because they're creating a coding academy made in Africa for Africans where they end up servicing a lot of big global corporations, many of them in the United States. Mandela's getting a lot of press. Grow Intelligence is getting a lot of press. But if we're going to stick to, say, other parts of Africa, right, that are not Nairobi, What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are the unicorns that are kind of being formed or expanded on right now?
So there were actually several things you guys talked about that I sort of want to touch on in addressing that. And one is there's a reason why Facebook and Google are now trying to provide internet access in developing countries. One, Africa has become the new frontier for technology, cheap technology, so it's easily exploitable. That's what's happening. In the last 6 months, 500 startups has gone into Africa 4 times. 500 startups is one of the leading tech accelerators. In fact, they may actually still be in Africa right now. There was a 4-stop trip, they call it Geeks on a Plane, where they do Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa. So Monique, who is my classmate at Stanford, she's a venture partner at 500 Startups focused on Black and Latino founders. Alongside Dave McClure, who's actually the founder of 500 Startups, were actually in Africa this couple of weeks ago, maybe last week actually. Mike Siebel, who is the CEO of Y Combinator, the leading tech accelerator, was in Nigeria in October. So they have discovered Africa, period. And Nigeria being the largest Black nation, with population of, I think, over 200 million, even though some people say that's not the case, is like a virgin ground. And the thing is, I say, innovation happens everywhere, not just in Silicon Valley. And what they're realizing is innovation in Silicon Valley has become too expensive. For instance, to get into 500 startups, they give you $125,000 for 5% equity in your startup, right? Now, imagine what $125,000 would do in Nigeria, right? If you had to invest that in maybe 20, 30, 40 companies. Because these are people who, one, don't have access to capital, so will take anything at almost any terms. 2, the exchange rate, makes your money, your tiny little $5,000, $10,000 go a long way. So now Africa pretty much has become another exploitable ground for Western technological or venture capital focused firms, which is why it's important that those of us in diaspora, as well as those back home, understand that opportunity and actually take advantage of it now. Otherwise, what happened with oil, in fact, what has happened with our resources in the past decades and centuries would happen again in tech. Now, when you talk about startups that are doing, wonderful stuff, I mean, Lagos alone, everyone talks about Nairobi because of fintech, right? I don't remember the name of, there was no, it's not Mobicasa. I don't remember.
The M-Pesa which is celebrating its 10 years this year, by the way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So M-Pesa was like the leading, innovative fintech platform that sort of launched Kenya out there. But now there's actually a lot, and actually Andela is not African founded.
One of the co-founders,
he
he left, but he's still a co-founder, Ian.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we have to claim at least a little bit of credit for.
That is we're not seeing the money though.
Okay.
The 24 million came in after he left.
Okay.
So we can still, they're doing awesome work, don't get me wrong.
Right.
In Lagos. But it's important that we start to own, that we start to launch our own stuff. Which is why it was pertinent that we actually launched a Startup 52 class in Nigeria.
Yes.
And in fact, part of what we're doing now is looking for global partners or partners on the continent who are interested in setting up satellite Startup 52 locations and can, find 1 or 2 or 3 startups that we will work with virtually, right? So we provide you with the perks that our classes get. We provide mentorship, advisement, all of that stuff. So if any of you know people back home or even here who are connected to startups that are looking for acceleration programs, please, I'd like to talk to you. Because for instance, this actually hurts me, which is why I can't really talk about it. So the Minister of Science and Technology in Nigeria, the new one, his first initiative was for Nigeria to start to produce pencils, wooden pencils. Who uses wooden pencils anymore? Right? So we can't even rely on government to take us into the new technological age, which is why that responsibility falls on all of us, right? Those in diaspora, those back home, who understand the importance of taking the reins of technology and running with it. Because the truth is, you cannot cap innovation. Innovation will happen any and everywhere. And it's important that we start to do that. That leads me back to, when you talked about CDC trying to force software on, that didn't work. The truth is, we know our problems, we have the solutions, we probably don't have the opportunities to launch them, but it's important that we start to understand the power in what we can do, and not just understand it, but actually start to do them. So the question is, how do we galvanize our people here who have the money, because the other problem is, sometimes those of us who have money don't understand tech and venture capital, real estate, oil, fashion, or wherever the industries are, the legacy industries, they understand better, so they invest in that. But teaching them to understand the importance of venture capital and investing in, startups, it's extremely important, because capital goes a long way in, building stuff. Otherwise, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg would create access to internet and would own all of those people who use that, period, right?
But I have to once again push back, because I'm living proof of, I'm that guy who's met every African billionaire trying to raise money for my ventures and got rejected by every single one of them. And my ventures were funded by Goldman Sachs in New York City or Google. My True Africa just got funded by Google. And I've never been able to raise $1 on the African continent with my track record. So I'm just wondering, as somebody who does not have as much experience or networks as I do, how does one just break through the clutter and get that critical venture capital to grow?
That's actually, that's a very great point, right? So like I said, I really wanted to meet Ms. Alakija from yesterday. She's the wealthiest black woman in the world currently, to talk about the importance of venture capital, right? We need more angel networks, period. We need more venture capitalists, period. We need more wealthy people understanding the importance of tech. So part of the reason why you may never have gotten funded from the continent is they don't understand tech. Why are we talking about going to the moon when we can't feed our people down here? That's probably the way they think, without understanding that these are the next frontiers for moving the continent into the technological age, right? So
But that's a very good example, though, and we have to stay with this one for a minute. I interviewed her for the keynote at MIT 3 years ago, and I spent an hour convincing her that investing in African tech is a good investment. I literally spent an hour doing that. Has she made any tech investments? It's like a lot of African high net worth or very wealthy Africans like infrastructure businesses, they like mining deals, they like oil and gas deals, but a lot of these more high risk ventures that we engage in, I don't think they see the pattern or the profitability.
So this is how we do it. We have African students here at Harvard. We have African students at pretty much all the Ivy Leagues in, highly selective schools. We have Africans and black people that are wealthy in this country and in the diaspora, who I believe understand the importance of tech. That's why we're here, right?
Right.
Now, you don't need to be a billionaire to invest in tech. And actually in America, all you need is $200,000 to be an accredited investor, right? If you make $200,000 a year, you are by law an accredited investor. So you can actually invest in tech. Now, if you bring 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 people like that, whether they're doctors, whether they're finance, Wall Street, whatever it is, and say, listen, we need to invest in tech. And we are able to put our money together and actually do investments in DreamAfrica, in other startups like them. There's Shops NG, there's Hotels NG. There are several things and several platforms that are doing extremely well. And invest in them. And then get to the point where these become unicorns. Then the legacy money, all they're looking for is really profits. Then you can go back and say, listen, this is how much we put in this company that is now valued at this. Set aside a portion of your wealth or your, whatever, to focus on venture capital.
But there is an educational process as
Of
well,
course,
and that's why we need accelerators, that's why we need education like
Yes.
DreamAfrica, because I have personally, in addition to investing in my own True Africa platform, I've invested in 17 African startups,
Wonderful.
and only 2 of them are still in business today. And so we know that every venture capitalist loses money, but when I actually spend time tracking that money that I wired into their account, their mom needed a fridge. And then, there was like so many basic needs that a lot of that money that I wired to their account was not actually used for growing a business.
Right.
So we also have that issue to consider.
Yes.
That's why we need to build an entire ecosystem that will
Yes.
have the educational aspect. That's why I'm glad you mentioned Y Combinator and all these other companies as well. So tell us maybe what the roadmap might be for you guys.
So it's funny you mentioned that. We actually this year decided to gradually move away from the acceleration model into more of an ecosystem model that has 8 stakeholders, from the tech founders to mentors to corporations to educational institutions to service providers, which is legal, tax, blah, 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 to interns, high school, college, and postgraduate interns to work with the startups. So sort of creating an ecosystem that supports the tech founder in their ventures. That's symbiotic, right? So founders, benefit from that. And those stakeholders learn either from, learn how to innovate like the founders do, or whatever it is they can gain from those relationships. Because we understand the importance of the well-being of the entrepreneur.
Right.
Now, most times when people say they failed, of course there are several reasons why people fail. But if it boils down to livelihood, right, 99% of the time is because survival is still important, right?
Right.
If you can't eat or pay rent, there are more pressing issues than, the business.
Absolutely.
Right? So creating ecosystems that are supportive of the well-being is important.
Right.
As well as, the business itself. So yeah.
Okay. This is I want to go back to the government sector because I think it's really important that we talk about leadership. And I'm going to say this again: we need better leadership in Africa. So, Dan, with your experience, kind of going into Liberia, kind of deep into Liberia, working directly with Madam President. I'm actually plugging Helene Cooper's book that just came out, Madam President, on Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Harvard alum. How was it working in an environment where she came in after the Civil War? And I say this because, and I'm asking this question, I'm going to preface this by saying, my team did a bit of work in Liberia last year, and with one of our partners, the Bridge International Academies, which is a charter school that is pretty much taking over the entire educational, primary and secondary school educational, or a big part of it in Liberia. So we did a bit of work there, and it's very difficult work, very controversial company, very difficult, a lot of resistance coming in from the government. So we realized that an 18-year-old Liberian woman might be more likely to be married than to actually know how to read and write, and that's a real fact. So when you're coming into a situation where there's basically no infrastructure, no structure, and you're able to affect change at the highest level, how do you go about it, and how do you perhaps help to implement certain tools that are a little bit more adapted than the ones that were brought in by the CDC?
Yeah. So I mean, we typically we're not bringing in technology. Is one thing. Yeah. So I mean, at that moment, I went to Liberia in 2008 to work in the president's office there, and yeah, like you say, that's after a long period of civil war, and prior to that, sort of economic mismanagement in the country, and you're talking about a government system that was pretty broken. And yeah, I mean, I think I don't think first of all, I think it's a long game. So I think in some sense there's sort of expectations outpace what's possible in terms of government change in a sort of a really tough situation like that. But I think you got to get some things working quickly. That's and then you sort of build out from there, right? So it is, and that's why we do think leadership is important, because in that moment, you're talking about, and President Sirleaf says it herself, she looked around in those early years and said, she had all these ambitions for her country after all these years of trying to knock on the door, losing the election to Charles Taylor in 1997. She's finally there, and she looked around and she felt like she had a system around her that didn't work. So what do you do? First of all, you try to bring in people to the best that you can who can lead the ministries you care about most. Politics are tricky, so you've got to choose carefully in terms of who you put in place for different reasons, but you got to put your top talent in the places you care about most. How are you using your time as a leader? What are you focused on? How are you holding your those key ministers and sectors to task? So we put a lot of emphasis on sort of the systems of government and the way leaders are focusing their time and energy. That's a really hard thing to do, right? I mean, she's only one person, as exceptional as she is. And I think she did bring in a pretty amazing group of leaders, in those early years. But you're talking about a slow burn to get the system to change, and you're specifically referencing the education system, which is, I think, a pretty broken system right now. There's no denying that, which is why the government has gone this controversial route that you're referring to, Claude, in it's not the whole system, but bringing in some private providers. I think they're looking for solutions. They're looking to shake up things, and this is one way to try. I'm not saying it's necessarily right or wrong, but it's one attempt to change things up. And you've got to find a way to shake up the system.
Right, but then I want to stay with Liberia just a little bit longer, because in this particular case, Bridge International Academies, this company, this very controversial company that my team worked with last year, they sold the president on the fact that they had this incredible software that could allow Liberian children to basically read and write, and so they had a very big technology play built into their startup. They're very kind of successful startup, I might add. And then so when you look at the demographic growth of a country like Liberia, there just aren't enough teachers to teach all these primary school children. There just aren't any. And even if you start going into rural areas, it makes it even harder. So the promise of technology can be enchanting to a leader at that level, right? So when you're coming in as an advisor, what role do you play? Are you maybe more of a sparring partner where you kind of challenge a lot of those big dreams and bring it back to reality? I mean, what is the role of an advisor at that level coming in with that Tony Blair badge?
Yeah, and again, we're not sort of telling the government what the right policy is. So I don't want to sort of get into a thing about sort of that particular issue, but I think just to use that example, I think what we would see our role as, and we do work with the Minister of Education in Liberia, Minister Werner, and we would see our role as making sure that they're hearing all the options that leaders should hear. So not just from the pitch from Bridge, but others. And by the way, I think one key change that happened to the policy, just to nuance what you're saying, is that Bridge is not the only provider. I think there are something, it's like 6 or 7 different providers that are now.
Right.
So it's not just Bridge.
I meant Bridge and all the other charter schools that are being launched.
So, and so I think there have been important design decisions about this approach that have happened as a result of not just hearing from Bridge, for example. I think the other thing is it's going to be rigorously, randomly controlled. M&E, there's a rigorous M&E system that they're putting in place around it. Again, but I hear your point about, it is interesting you're bringing up a policy area where I think tech was one of the sort of, as you said, enchanting things about it to some extent. And that is the Bridge model. I don't think the others so much, talk about, sort of teaching through this very,
no, they don't.
Systemized approach to the same extent. So
right.
That is, I think, one of the advantages of getting these different models side by side, frankly.
Right. So it's time for Q&A. We've talked about a lot of things. I wanted to talk about fintech. I wanted to talk about edtech. I wanted to talk about agriculture. I wanted to talk about the way that technology is affecting culture, society, business, and government all over the continent. And one of the things, before we get to the questions, I would like to emphasize the importance of the diaspora in creating change. And if we look at the remittances, if we look at the actual transfer of knowledge, you are the ones that we're going to be counting on to make a difference at the leadership level and at the grassroots level in Africa. So before you ask your question, I'd like you to introduce yourself by saying where you're from, because I want to see the diversity of the continent and other continents as well. So we'll start all the way in the back over there. Please, if you could stand up and just... Yeah. Are there any mics, roving mics at all?
No, it's fine. I'm
okay.
a professor, I can be loud. I'm Dr. Dendere. I teach African politics at Gettysburg College. My question for you guys is, how do you think we can use technology in voting and elections? One of my students brought to my attention that biometric voting, which is being introduced across the continent, could actually be used for rigging in a very effective way. So of course, I'm not a tech person. I just panicked when I read this week. And he had a whole list of countries where biometric voting could be the worst thing for us. But he's an undergrad, so I'm not sure how much he knows, and I don't know enough to push back on that. So I wanted to know if you guys have thought of it at all. Is biometric voting the way to go? Is that the future for democracy? Are we putting ourselves in a pit where ZANU-PF can effectively rig scandal type situation and keep themselves in power for 40 or 50 more years? And also the cost of technology. I understand that in DRC, the biometric system cost $50 million, which probably contributed to the cancelling of the 2017 election.
Right, or postpone, or canceling, not cancel. It hasn't been canceled per se, but yeah,
What I read is that it has been cancelled for this year.
Oh, right, for this year. But well, yeah, I would have said postpone. But that's a great question, and I probably that's a really good one. Maybe you want to take a stab at it. But I'll just say, I'm not so sure that a lot of these heads of state are really excited about biometric voting across the continent. But it is a necessity, and it is a great idea. But certainly the ones that I've engaged with as an outsider, I'm not really sure that they would want to implement this anytime soon. However, you may have a different point of view, Dan, or maybe Torin, you have an opinion on this, or Chike maybe.
I'm good. This is what I'd say. I think sometimes there's a huge reliance on westernization that is sometimes we actually try to impose on ourselves that don't work. Biometric could work if the right things are in place, right? So, for instance, that may actually work here, even though they don't really use it, because everyone has the fingerprint, the biometric, whatever information. We don't have that infrastructure yet. So it will be difficult to use that effectively. That's one. Two, there are several other things you need in place for even those equipments or whatever to work. Power, for instance. Nigeria is nowhere close to being anywhere in anything that has to do or rely on power, right? So what happens if power goes off? How do you document that? Does it store that and the rest of the people have to wait 3 days for power to come back before you go on? So there's several things, and sometimes I feel like we rush into such decisions or technological, or we get excited about things that are not actually, that we're not ready for. So could it work in the future? Maybe, just like people thought, cell phones wouldn't work and we somehow skipped the analog and went straight to GSM. So it may work in the future, but there are certain things that need to be in place for that to happen. The truth is, any and every election could be rigged. So it's managing the risk of that or trying to find ways to minimize that. So yeah.
Anything to add, Dan, or? Yeah.
I mean, I 100% agree with Chike, but the sort of irony I thought of just as you were talking is some people sort of, in sort of looking back at the U.S. election and concerns about the potential for Russian hacking, felt that one of the reasons that was going to be, frankly, really hard to do in the U.S. is how outdated U.S. voting systems are, and that each state has totally outdated, frankly, pretty crummy sort of systems that
with voter suppression and everything else, yeah.
I mean, pretty much, is going to make it would make it tough to do. So, I mean, that's a slightly different issue about the sort of feasibility in Africa right now. But I certainly right. My instinct when I hear that is don't assume tech is going to be the solution to fair voting necessarily.
Very good. There was a question here, a gentleman on the side. Can you stand up and ask your question? Yes, absolutely. You. Yeah.
My name is Al DK Jr. Thank you all for your time. I'm from Nigeria, but based in Atlanta, Georgia. Dan, you mentioned the intersection of policy and governance, and that was encouraging. But I think, I'm afraid that we may be kind of looking at that in a binary way and not in a really unconventional way, right? So When I think of technology, technology can be utilized as a conduit to improve governance and transparency, right? So I guess my question is, how would you, one, encourage an entrepreneur who has an idea around such, let's say, a technological platform, right, that would improve transparency and accountability, right? But how would you encourage that entrepreneur to build, to go to a government leader with the objective of this government leader to build consensus to now create new policy to say, hey, look, all trade, commerce needs to be done on this platform, right? That's the first question. But even beyond that, with the Tony Blair organization, I think there's a tremendous opportunity there to create a forum, perhaps where it could be government leaders and entrepreneurs with great ideas to come together. Hence the public and private partnership theme that we've throughout the conference. How can we come together to perhaps facilitate this? Because I think you cannot do business in sub-Saharan Africa without the government. Point blank, I've seen it with my own two eyes, right? There needs to be buy-in. But solutions can't be done in silos. It needs to be in a room where perhaps we have intermingled government leaders, presidents, heads of states, and aspiring entrepreneurs who have amazing ideas. So that's my question. I'm sorry for taking too long.
No, it's a great question. Was it a question for Dan or?
It was primarily targeted at Dan, but
Yeah.
anybody can feel free to chime in.
Okay. So should I start maybe, or? Well, I mean, I think we should look at Rwanda. I'm glad you mentioned Rwanda because I think they have two private equity funds that are very interesting in the way they run, right? And no matter what you think of Kagame or whatever, from a private enterprise and a technological innovation perspective, I think they are doing a lot of things right. With respect to attracting foreign direct investment, creating a startup culture, bringing in talent from pretty much everywhere, getting people to collaborate, the state funding some of these, and creating accelerator schemes, entrepreneurship schemes, youth-driven schemes, women-driven schemes. I mean, there's a lot that they're experimenting with. So I think that's a really good model, actually. But perhaps, have you seen anything interesting, Torin, that you might want to share with us? Maybe in South Africa.
So one of the ways that I want to just tackle this is, yesterday. So in order to kind of move things forward, you also have to acknowledge what the realities are as well, right? Like I am not a blind optimist by any means. I wanted to allude to this a little bit earlier with your comment about governments being accepting of essentially dissent, right? On January 21st of this year, upwards of 4 million people gathered together to march across every single continent for the Women's March. That was the day after our president-elect became president of the United States. There was no significant sense of organization. It was a social movement. People knew what day it was going down, and if they felt the passion in their heart, they were going to show up. And in many ways, I believe that the voices of the people will ultimately be heard when those voices are consistent and when those voices are not quiet. And in my opinion, we see it right now. Every single day here in the United States, there are peaceful protests happening for different things that's happening that people care about. And it is an incredible demonstration of civic engagement, of we don't want things to be negative, or we want to challenge things because we believe what we believe, right? And that's part of being an active citizen. That's part of being a person who wants to be a change agent. And I think that the more that we have examples of that, the more that platforms like True Africa and platforms like DreamAfrica, showcase wonderful stories, but also provide ways for just the amazing stories that are out there to be heard and shared, the louder those voices get. And governmental leaders, I get it. There are some old dudes who are presidents who don't want anybody else to take over. There's a lot of corruption, but in the end of the day, they talk about the the arc of the universe. It will bend towards good things if we consistently fight towards it. So that's what I want to encourage you to do, man. And I already learned a little bit about your work. Just keep being curious, keep fighting, keep learning.
On a note of optimism, did you have?
Out something. There's this, I think, is an annual program, annual competition, a challenge by Citigroup. It's called T4I, where they partner with several emerging countries to try to tackle corruption and all that stuff. It's currently going on right now, I believe. If you look it up, T4I Challenge, Citigroup. And what they do is they actually source innovation or innovative ideas from founders globally that are trying to solve corruption and non-transparency, whatever issues in their countries. They have demo days, they have mentorship, and they partner with a whole bunch of organizations. Style 52 is one of them this year, to provide resources as well as access. So they partner with governments as well to present them with the solutions, the best solutions they think are viable enough. And I think to some extent Citigroup actually funds a part of it, right? They put probably 100,000 or so, I'm not sure. So initiatives like that, could serve as conduits to, solving some of those problems. But you also mentioned something that is very important, being able to, bridge the gap between government and founders, entrepreneurs. Whosoever can do that effectively is up to something big. So, thanks for that.
I wanted to take one question on this side, maybe over here, maybe. That'll be the final question before we.
Hi everyone, my name is Aisha and I'm from Guinea. So my question's more for GK. You guys have been talking about the funding of entrepreneur and startup. So recently I discovered that I'm really passionate about entrepreneurship, and I've been going to a lot of events or conferences and all of that. So I've been curious. I've been looking about venture capitals or people willing to invest on entrepreneurs, because forgot your name, the one from DreamAfrica. Like you said, now we have a lot of African entrepreneurs, but I think that we don't have a lot of investor or venture capital for that. We need funds in order to be to invest in Africa or to create something. And I think that African actually millionaire or billionaire in the continent are not willing to help the youth. They're already out there, having their big company, having their big name out there. I look them up one by one, the big name that I know so far, South Africa, the guy Aliko from Nigeria, Accra, Ghana, and all of them. None of them is really helping a startup in Africa.
Tony Elumelu is in Nigeria. He created a $100 million fund. Sorry, but let's finish. Yeah.
Okay, so I was just wondering, what can we do to just help them understand that if they're really willing to help the continent, it's not only in providing jobs. They also have to help entrepreneurs in order to create jobs, not only employing people. What can we do in that sense, to have more people willing to invest on the youth in Africa?
So you're going to say something now?
Just really quick, raise your hand in the room if you're comfortable with losing money.
Yeah.
If you're comfortable with losing money. Yeah? Okay. Good. So there is, so that was maybe. Yeah, that's true. Well, look, essentially, in order for, I left the corporate world to pursue my dreams, right? In and of itself, that is a risk. There's no guarantee that DreamAfrica is going to be a success. I do believe that it will be. We're working our butts off to make it a success, but there's absolutely no guarantee. Similarly, I was actually at the Harvard Africa Business Conference in 2016. Clayton Christensen, who is a professor of innovation and all that stuff, he talked about how the return on investment, capital, is actually flat over the last 12 years. And so he said, why should we even consider investment when we see the impact of what we're doing when we give dollars to, let's say, NGOs or nonprofits? And so that was a very interesting question for me. But we were part of the TEEP class of Tony Elumelu Entrepreneurship Program in 2015. And it was already mentioned, but I mean, he's obviously an African billionaire. He decided to invest $100 million in 10,000 startups over a 10-year period. Now, what that equates to is $10,000 per entrepreneur or company that's selected. For a Delaware-based company like DreamAfrica, that doesn't go very far. But it did help us to build relationships and open up our first office in Kenya. Now, in terms of what that means, the world of investment likes to see big numbers. $100 million, that's a big number. And they like to see big returns or big success stories. Now, last year we had our first unicorn, so Jumia, the online retailer, right? They received somewhere upwards of $300 million in funding from a variety of different investors. And so their valuation went above $1 billion. That's an African company. Now, our perception of risk goes down.
Jumia is not an African company.
It's actually Rocket.
It's owned by Rocket Internet.
Rocket Internet, correct.
Which is German, yeah.
Correct.
That's correct.
So what's the association then?
So
You would know better, to
what
clarify.
What Rocket Internet does is they find models that are working in Western countries and they try to replicate them in emerging markets. So Jumia, I think hotels.ng, some of the technically successful and growing startups with very high valuations are actually Rocket Internet companies. So they start these companies in different countries, and German is the CEO, but then every other person who runs it is local, which gives the illusion of a local company, but it really isn't. So that's what's going on.
So I say that to say, though, in terms of perception, right? It means that amount of dollars was able to be seen on the continent. That's what I'm saying.
Right.
As the perception shifts to more of these success stories, people will, over time, be more likely to put their dollars into entrepreneurs.
No, I just, we have time for no more questions, but we do have time for, unfortunately, 30-second wrap-up by each one of the participants. So you have the mic, so you can start then.
Oh, okay.
I know you don't like starting, but this time you're starting.
No, that's fine.
No, it's 3:32. We're already.
It's piggybacking on her question.
We can't because we have to be on time. We started on time.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So let me add to that, right? So the beautiful thing about being Africans and being entrepreneurs is we make shit happen. That's the truth, with or without, right? In fact, I
30
could,
seconds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could tell you the story of Startup 52 afterwards if you want to know. It's been self-sponsored for the past 2 years, without a dime from outside. But what I was trying to say, and I'm actually glad he pointed the Jumia story out, is this. It's important that we galvanize. So the fact that you're thinking about that, I'm thinking about it, so many other people are thinking about the importance of investing in Africa as Africans is a step in the right direction. So if we can get more people together to do that, that starts to solve the problem. Besides having to depend on the billionaires and the people whom we think we expect to. Yeah.
I was just going to say, the next thing right now is a coffee break, in case you wanted to stick around for a little
Yes.
while.
Okay.
As I was thinking about the message that I wanted to give to you, it was very simple. If you see a problem, aim to fix it. If you see a challenge, don't run away from it. And if you see a bright future, march towards it. It's just that simple. That's my 30 seconds right there.
Wonderful. Thank you.
I didn't get a chance to respond to the question that was gone. But anyway, just quickly, watchdog role on government, civil society, keeping an eye on making sure government doing what it's saying it's going to do. That's an important role for civil society, not necessarily something you do with government. I was very intrigued by the other point of, though, how do we get government to bridge the divide a bit and sort of foster an ecosystem for technology, innovation, and entrepreneurs in a country? And I think that is a role for collaboration to bridge that. So I think that's a really interesting idea that he came up with.
Right. So I wanted to just add one thing before I thank my wonderful panelists. I'm having actually a part 2 of this discussion. I'm leading a talk with 2 entrepreneurs on April 11th at MIT, at the MIT Media Lab, the top floor at 12 o'clock. It's going to be food and drinks, everything provided. And the topic is very interesting. It's very similar. It's, does technology really lead to African development? So if you want to come, it's just down the road at MIT, April 11th at 12. But I want to thank my wonderful panelists because I feel like we just began to scratch the surface and we could have kept going for another hour. But it's great that you were so engaged. I want to thank you for coming. It was a wonderful discussion, and I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Thank you.